Happy Halloween, everyone! Welcome back to Tales from the Crypt. I know that this year Halloween's going to be very different for most of us, but I hope that the spooky stories that I share with you can help put even just a hint of normalcy back into this creepy holiday. This week, I'll be sharing some true stories with you about a dangerous squatter, a ghost with serious boundary issues, and not one, but two different stories about restless female spirits. All right, now grab that cauldron full of candy, turn down the lights, and let's get started with... He was going to come back for me. So, this happened when I was about 18. I had just moved out of my mom's house in the summer to live near my boyfriend while he attended college, and I worked full-time. For context, I'm a woman. I lived with 3 other girls in a shifty apartment building. Happened to be around Thanksgiving, and because I worked a minimum wage job I was new at, I wasn't going to request a week off to go home. Which was fine, I'd be making money anyway. After a few days of being in the apartment complex alone, I noticed it was just me and the old man in the apartment above me. Neither of us had a car, so the entire lot was empty. I worked from about 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., which was closing, at a coffee shop. One of these boring days, I walked the block to the bus stop because I didn't have a car at the time. The bus was running at odd hours as it was a college campus and all the students were gone for break. Now, I've always been aware of things around me, people, noises, placement of things. I've been through some horrible things, but this one still scares me even now, though I live states away. I was waiting at the bus stop just before dark when a man, probably about 24 years old, and about 5'5", appeared. I noticed his body type was pretty muscular, not that I was checking him out, just observing. He smiled at me, which made me feel better, of course. I'd never even seen where he'd come from. He was just there behind me suddenly and struck up a conversation. I remember he had really dark eyes that seemed to never look away. I remember even thinking to myself that he wasn't blinking. Just pure deranged crazy in his eyes, which was so mismatched from the smile he plastered on his face. He spoke to me a bit and asked how I was, what I was up to, etc. Typical pre-COVID stranger chatter. He said he was from Africa and studying for his master's. He seemed well versed in what he said he was studying also, so I never assumed he was lying. Eventually, the bus comes and we both get on, sitting around the same part in the front. I ride for about 5 minutes before getting off and walking the rest of the way to work, which was about 3 blocks. I go in, clock in, starting my shift. I glance up outside, and there he is, the guy from the bus. I thought it was weird, of course, and pointed it out to my coworkers. Everyone agreed it was weird as well. He just idles by the door. One of 10 people I've seen in the whole town since break started, and it had to be this guy. He stayed for about an hour and eventually fades away without me noticing. I go on with my shift, not thinking too deep into it. The idea that I carried a knife was enough to comfort me. After my shift, I get back on the bus towards home, walk through the empty parking lot and into my quiet apartment building. I was on the third floor. I skipped steps with my keys out already, and when I reached the top of the steps, guess who's there besides our boy? This is when I knew I should be concerned. I didn't think anyone else lived in the building, and I never mentioned I did, and I certainly did not mention my apartment number. He looks up and sees me, gives another one of those friendly smiles, and says my name cheerfully. Another thing I never told him. I acknowledged him as I moved around him to enter my apartment. He moved back and started to move down the stairs, so I opened the door and he immediately ran back up and puts his arm in the door. Somehow he did this so friendly? I almost thought he did have good intentions. He mentions that he can see my Xbox in the living room from the door and rushes in to play. He eagerly asks me to play and starts sitting down, taking off his shoes. I mentioned that my roommates are asleep and I couldn't hang out as I had work early and my boyfriend was coming over soon. All lies, of course. He couldn't take the hint, so I asked him to hang out another time, which of course I was not going to do. He mentions he lives across the hall diagonal from me, which was strange because I was acquaintances with a few people who lived there and I wasn't familiar with him living there. I became scared. I told him I'd be back and went to my bathroom as I left my front door open. I immediately called my boyfriend. Now I'm not sure at all why I didn't just call the cops. I suppose I just didn't want to make a scene. He tells me he's sending a friend to come get me who also still happened to be in town. I was freaked and decided, okay, I'll just go out and play nice. When I exit the bathroom, he's putting his shoes on and he was leaving. I was confused but happy. He tries to hug me and I declined, saying I was a bit sick. He nods and leaves my apartment. He walks about 10 feet to the apartment diagonal from me and goes in smiling and wishing me a good night. I shut the door, making sure it was locked, and proceeded to check the other doors and windows in my apartment. All of the windows were good, and then I got to the back door. I've always tried to feel as secure as I can in my house, taking extra security steps as I was a young female. I checked the lock on the back door. It's unlocked. My heart dropped to my stomach. I immediately burst into tears. I knew for a fact I had locked this door and placed the long wooden stick to keep it from sliding open. I checked it twice before I left for work. The stick was gone. I never actually found it. We reported it to the police as it was clear his intentions were not good. He checked the apartment and nobody answered, so they left a patrol car nearby. The next day they contacted the building owners and were able to enter the apartment. Big surprise, he didn't live there. He had been squatting there since the 4 people who lived there left for Thanksgiving. Nothing else was done, which makes sense. Nobody else knew this guy, where he lived, went to school, nothing. Be safe out there, guys. It crawled into bed with me. So when I was about 17, my family had just moved back to Canada after living in the US. It was a bit sudden, and being a family of 6, it was a little bit of a scramble to find a place to house all of us before the snow hit. So my mom and dad decided to live in an old house that my grandpa had on his property, just for the duration of the approaching winter ahead. The house belonged to my great-uncle, and my grandpa skid it from his brother's property to his place. Now, my grandpa has 2 quarter sections, and this house is tucked way back away from his main house, so the power is run from the main house, and with it being so far away, there's no running water. This house is old, so to add to the no running water, there also isn't any heat, only a wood stove. Just to give you an idea of what we were living in. Me, being a 17-year-old, I often stayed in town and didn't stay there very often, not just because it was a pain with the no water and heat, but because shit was creepy. I specifically remember the first time it happened. I was in my bed. I was the only one who would stay downstairs. With the wood stove, everyone wanted to sleep upstairs since it was warmer. So I was just starting to fall asleep, and I started to feel the room get really heavy. I remember the feeling of not being alone. The doorway didn't have a door on it. It only had a beaded curtain, and I could feel it standing there. I then remember having the feeling of total fear rush over me, and I was frozen to my core from it. Then it moved closer, and I felt the bed move, and someone crawl right up beside me. Not in a way that was super noticeable, but in a sneaky, slow, sloth-moving type of way. I specifically remember wanting to vomit with fear. Then I felt it. The feeling of an unshaven face rub against mine. I lost my damn mind. I scrambled out of bed holding my blanket and ran up the stairs to my parents' room. I was so out of my mind with fear I couldn't scream. I slept on the floor on my dad's side of the bed. The next morning, my mom was wondering why her 17-year-old daughter was curled up at the foot of their bed, and I told her what happened. Later that morning, we walked over to my grandpa's house to have breakfast and go chat while my mom brought up my wild story. My grandpa and grandma silently listened, and as my mom was laughing at the last bit of the story, My grandparents got really serious and turned to each other. Apparently, this has been an issue in the old house, and they didn't want to tell us, hoping if we didn't acknowledge it, then it wouldn't bother us. I can honestly say it didn't feel angry or upset, it just wanted to cuddle. I didn't stay there much after that. I moved in with a cousin in town. Restless spirit. I always believed in the supernatural, and throughout my childhood, my grandma told us stories from the nights when she would hear noises or see shadows on the walls. She for sure knew she saw them, but she never really questioned it and simply told us it's a ghost that lives in my house. She's told us before a clear explanation of what exactly the ghost looks like. A tall woman with long brown hair wearing brown boots and one of those 1900s period dresses. I guess she was showing off her boots to my grandma, not sure how else she could have seen them in that long dress. The most memorable story she's told us is one I'll never forget, which is true. I think of it at least once a week for some reason or another. So, to make the story make sense, let's start from the beginning. My grandparents' house is basically a big rectangular house with a large opening in the middle. I would say maybe around 5,000 square feet, give or take. I'm bad at math. It first started off as one small kitchen and 2 rooms, and as time passed, more rooms were added on. And that original house is one of the rooms that my grandmother would normally stay at when she was by herself. Before you get to that room, there's a living room, and then straight ahead will be the room which has these 2 French-style doors, and depending on which one you close first, it'll either overlap and not close correctly, or if you do it right, it'll close very tightly, and you definitely need some force to open them back up. Well, one night my grandma tells us she was continuously being woken up by bangs on those French doors, and feeling like someone was sitting on the edge of her bed by her feet. As the night passed, those 2 French doors would begin to creak, as if someone was trying to open them, and of course, being that it was in the middle of the night, who could be trying to open the door? So, my grandma just kept shaking it off and turning around so her back was facing the doors. As soon as she settled in and closed her eyes, the doors began to bang louder until they were thrown open. My grandma grabbed her pillow and screamed out loud, "Chinga tu madre!" and went to stay on the opposite side of the house. I'm not sure how long after, but she went to go visit a curandero to see if she could get some answers. Well, she was told this woman was killed around the time of the Mexican Revolution, and her body was just left there where her house now stands. And more precisely, facing those 2 French doors. And she simply wanted her bones or whatever remains were left to be buried, rightfully, in an actual tomb so she could finally rest. Interestingly enough, there's this random clear glass square on the ceiling, and the sunlight shines this ray of light down to where this woman's bones are supposedly located. My grandma later asked if she happened to have a treasure or money buried along with her, with the curandero replying, "Not likely, she just wants to be respectfully buried." My grandma threw her hand up in the air and said, whatever, then I'm not taking her out. Gotta respect my grandma's hustle. So the noises kept happening to her, but she just simply ignored them. Fast forward a decade, and it was the summer of 2014. We were there for a cousin's wedding. At this point, each corner of the house belongs to an aunt, and my mom has her part of the house all the way in the back, which is good because we're kind of in our own little section away from everybody, since you have to go through my grandpa's old room before you get to ours. But it's also bad because there's only one working restroom, and it's all the way in the front of the house. And I don't know about you, but having to go pee in the middle of the pitch black night of Mexico, and you have to walk all that way, all the while there's lechuzas hooting at you. No thanks. So I always make sure I don't drink anything before bedtime, and for sure use the restroom before everyone goes to sleep. One of my aunts was not there that summer, and she had recently built her section of the house along with a working restroom. So then that made 2 restrooms, but it's basically unavailable to anybody because she usually locks her room, which I don't blame her. Having 15 plus people ask to use your restroom and the mess that's left behind, yeah, no thanks. But since she wasn't there that summer, I thought my cousins and I, who were also visiting Mexico, could spend the night in there. So, altogether, it was me and 3 cousins staying in the room along with a newly born puppy. Since we're all animal lovers and there's a lot of stray animals over there, we always like to feed all the dogs, and usually there'd be puppies from a poor homeless dog needing food. So at this point, it was past midnight and we're talking about God knows what. Me and one of my cousins were staying on the bed while the other 2 cousins were on the floor with the puppy. Suddenly, we hear a loud bang at the front door. And trust me, it was loud because the front door is quite a few feet away from that room. We all screamed as we heard the bang and dared each other to go see who it was. During the summertime, there's a festival to celebrate the Virgen del Carmen, along with some carnival rides, and since my grandma's house is located in the center of the town they live in, usually there's music and noise past midnight. We can literally see the Ferris wheel from the house. So we assumed it was somebody wanting to come for a visit, but none of us was brave enough to go actually check. So my aunt's room is connected to the left side of the original part of the house, but in order to go into that part of the house, you have to walk outside that room, then go into the door that leads into the kitchen. We all start slowly falling asleep, and the moonlight was shining through the curtains just enough to see the silhouettes of my cousins sleeping on the floor. I would wake up every 10 to 15 minutes, tossing and turning, not even sure why. I wasn't feeling weird or anything, I just couldn't stay asleep past maybe 15 minutes. I kept checking my phone for the time, and it was around 2 a.m. I was fully awake, but had my eyes closed, trying to fall back asleep, when all of a sudden the puppy starts to cry. Now, of course, she could have been crying for various reasons, but the first thing that came to mind was that dogs are able to sense spirits, and we do happen to be next to the original part of the house where this ghost is supposedly buried. I try to ignore it and close my eyes again, but a few seconds later, I start to hear footsteps starting from the door, and I could hear them clearly walking up to me. I was so scared that I squeezed my eyes shut to make sure I didn't open them. At that moment, the puppy began to cry even louder, and I thought to myself, surely one of my other cousins will be woken up and say something. But no, the crying continued. I was literally frozen and I couldn't move my hands. I remember I told myself, make sure you're fully awake and not somehow dreaming all of this up. I'm not going to be like those people in scary movies who tell themselves nothing happened. But I was fully awake and knew exactly what I was hearing. Those footsteps were clear enough that I could tell it sounded like someone walking in boots. The footsteps continued until they stopped right behind me. My cousin's back was facing me, and I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to experience this, I'm not going to experience it by myself. And I started tapping my cousin's back while my eyes were still closed. I tapped, and no response. So I got desperate and started pinching her back so she could really wake up. But she would not wake up. Not sure how many minutes had passed, but I was still squeezing my eyes shut until all of a sudden I hear a girl's scream come from the street. Again, the room we were in was far away from the street, and that scream was clear in my ear, followed by laughs coming from a group of guys. I remember I started tearing up because I knew whatever this thing was messing with me. My mind was racing, and suddenly I thought, maybe the ghost was replaying the night she died to me, and that scream belonged to her. After the laughs passed, it was just silence and the moonlight filling the room. I told myself if I ever survive this night, I am never coming back here. The dozing off and waking up continued, and I finally got the courage to turn around to face the nightstand, grabbed my phone and my headphones so I could listen to music. Next thing I remember, I wake up one more time to the morning sun shining through the window and could hear my mom and aunt talking outside in the patio. I looked at the time and it was 7 a.m. and I kid you not, I started to tear up again. I could have sworn I was never going to see the light of day ever again. That night felt like an eternity. I still bring up this story to my cousin and I always ask her, why didn't you wake up? especially when I was pinching her back. She says she never felt the pinches, but that she was awake too, and she was too scared to turn over and ask me to wake up. The creepy part is she says I was snoring, and I'm like, nope, impossible. I was clearly not sleeping at all, and tell her she was knocked out, but she states she was fully awake. So I think to myself, maybe we were waking up opposite of each other, as in I would sleep for those 10 to 15 minutes while she would wake up, and vice versa, and the ghost was messing with us. A few days pass after that night, and my two sisters and I were sitting on the patio waiting for our turns to brush our teeth in the restroom. The part of the patio where we usually all sit is right in front of the original part of the house. Since it's Mexico, the floors are basically concrete, so anything that falls or hits the ground, you'll definitely hear a thump. There's a dining table right when you walk into the door leading into the original house, and the chairs are these very heavy steel chairs. And same like the French doors, you'll need a good effort to move them. As we waited for our aunt to come out of the restroom, we were standing directly across from the dining table. It's pitch black in the kitchen, and all of a sudden, we hear a chair being moved, clearly hearing the steel legs screeching against the concrete. All three of us looked at one another and with our eyes asked each other, "Did you hear that?" Plates started banging against each other all of a sudden. And yes, we were the only ones in that part of the house. Everyone was either in their part of the house, away from the kitchen, or in the restroom. We all stood frozen in fear and once again heard the chair screeching against the concrete floor. I remembered that night I went through and told my sisters I was going back to our room. I wasn't going to live through something like that again. I remember looking at my phone to see what time it was, and it was 2 a.m. I remember this was the same time the noises began the other night. My aunt at that point finally came out of the restroom, and we told her what we had just heard. She just looked at us and told us to go to our rooms, and she would finish turning off the lights. The next night, I was again sitting on the patio waiting for my sister to brush her teeth in the restroom. We had used the buddy system since we were kids, to use the restroom since it was always creepy to go by yourself to the restroom at night. There's a small makeshift window that looks into the kitchen, and for some reason, there was a pile of sand in front of the window. All of a sudden, I began to hear footsteps walking around the sand. They began very lightly and proceeded to get more clear. There are metal bars on the window, and they also began to make noises, as if someone was tapping their fingers on them. Luckily, my aunt was in there with me, and I ask if she's hearing that too. She nods yes, but says it's probably just the air, but there was no breeze. I knew what I was hearing. I look at my phone, and of course, the time was 2 a.m. At this point, I knew not to be around the area at that time. After that night, I didn't experience anything else for the remainder of our stay. That's also the last time I've been to Mexico, so I always wonder when I return if I'll experience that again. A few years later, around 2016, one of my aunts through marriage that lives in the same town was cleaning the house and getting it ready for my grandpa and aunts who were visiting for the summer. My grandma has Alzheimer's, so she's unable to stay by herself, so for the majority of the year, her house is left empty. My aunt was cleaning the room where the ghost is supposedly buried. She's very religious, but doesn't believe in ghosts or spirits. Well, she was walking through the foyer room when she says she literally moved out of the way to let the shadow pass by. She said as soon as she did that, she thought to herself, "Wait, I'm the only one here. Why did I just move out of the way so someone could pass by?" She said she grabbed her stuff, left, and refuses to go into the house unless someone is with her. There's many more stories from my aunts and uncles when they were children growing up in that house. One where they saw a doll with a sinister smile staring at them on the wall while they slept. Once they saw figures looking at them from inside the house while they were outside sitting on the patio. Whatever it is that's in that house will continue to haunt those walls until its remains are properly put into a resting place for them. The White Witch. In the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men, and I have to say, I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures many would never get to experience, and I'm thankful for every experience that life gave to me, even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a fully immersive experience, so he chose to move us into a small Japanese neighborhood off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, I kid you not, part of a huge zoo and on one side a fairly large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats about a mile downhill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but thick Indiana Jones-style jungle. Jungle the neighborhood kids and I would tromp through endlessly, ignoring the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in that cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we understood each other perfectly. Well, most of the time. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding their property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama-san, and she had us help her with her gardening whenever she would coax us over with green tea and chocolate or banana cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous, as was everyone else, actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama-san's home, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery. And that cemetery was unlike any cemetery I had ever seen before. Because Okinawa is an island, burials don't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built, many of them built into the sides of the hills that make up the island. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone set over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle of it for the coffin to be placed inside. Once inside, the square is inset with another piece of polished stone just inside, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside so offerings could be made to lost loved ones. Yen, food, flowers, incense are just some of the offerings given. Below Mama-san's house was a valley that swooped back up into another hill opposite her home. That valley and both hills were covered with these crypts, and spider webbing up and down through the crypts were various stone step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. One evening, Mama-san asked me to come visit with her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on a thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords, and told me she had a story to tell. Mama-san then disappeared for a few minutes and soon returned with a tray that held hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama-san said she had seen me, my brother, and some other kids daring each other to follow a stairway path down into the cemetery. You have to understand, the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and out of bushes and at a steep incline. It would be dangerous for anyone, but the real test was seeing how long we could take walking through the crypts at night. Mama-san wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils, monsters that would murder innocent citizens for no reason other than to kill. That fear was the product of wartime propaganda used to encourage young men into military service and farmers to fight alongside them. But many didn't. Many ran. And with nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off of cliff sides rather than face torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at hearing this. I had no idea that this had happened. I was mortified and hit with such sadness that I started to cry. The sun was setting and the sky went from pink and blue to a deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry. This was in the past, and the past is something we must always remember so we never go back. She went on with her story. One young woman had followed through with this sacrifice with her 2 children, but she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months. When she finally regained consciousness, she was horrified to realize she was not with her children. They had been buried somewhere in that cemetery below, in an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain, the torment of her loss unbearable, until the day she threw herself into the ocean, hoping to be reunited with her lost family. But they say she never found her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory. She would remain tortured for eternity. The sun had disappeared, the cemetery drowned in inky blackness, the main path dotted with dim, broken lights, feebly illuminating small areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders the cemetery, she said, looking for her kids. You can hear her crying. And then she pointed down. I didn't want to, but I did. I looked. In the back of the cemetery, in the darkness, there was a white figure. At first, a bright white shimmer. Moving slowly, kind of shaking, it moved from side to side like it was moving among the crypts, and you could actually hear the crying. Softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was terrified. I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far. But that is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many don't know her story, and they call her the White Witch, which angers her. It's best to stay away. It's best to pray for her. Mama-san said she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she will find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery, not once. And I never sat back there with Mama-san again either. That was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now, out of respect. I cried the whole time we were there. I prayed for all the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories, sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. I'd like to go back, to see if she's still there, wandering the graves, looking for her children. Thank you so much for joining me once again. I love hearing from those of you that I know personally, and I would love to get feedback from those of you that I don't know. So please drop me a comment below with your requests, suggestions, or even questions about some of the stories. You can always send me your submissions as well to tftcsub@gmail.com. That's tftcsub@gmail.com. Please remember to check out the details in my video description for links to listen to more of the creators behind our theme music, such marvelous monsters, and for a link for all of your tarot needs. But the most important thing that I am begging you all to do is please vote. Make your plan, go with a buddy. If you get anxious like I do, or if this is your first time voting and you don't really know what to expect, take your mask, know your rights as a voter, and please get it done. Have the spookiest Halloween, and I will see you all here again next week.